Ladies and gentlemen, we need to have a conversation about probably the most important thing in the country, the economy. Because without the economy, none of us actually have a job. No jobs, no bills, no food. But before we get on to the main news story, ladies and gentlemen, only 40% of you actually subscribe to the channel. And I really want to get to 100,000 subscribers. So you'd be doing me a massive favor if you hit that subscribe button. Help me get to 100,000 subscribers, at least before Keglecho gets there, Citizen Concern. She's growing at a good rate at the moment. So help a brother out, click the subscribe button. Anyway, let's get on to it. So a lot of people were actually really keen on the GNU because of the idea that it would inspire optimism in the economy. By inspiring this optimism, we'd get this new form of Ramaphoria. This new form of Ramaphoria would see an influx of investment, and that investment would ultimately, pull us out of our woes. So let's actually have a look and see what's happened. Well, to start, some of the risks of South Africa have alleviated, specifically electricity, because we've had it for some time. And there are some ideas that possibly there is some policy reform occurring in the country. And so now the IMF is now predicting that the South African economy will grow potentially by 1.5% this year. That's actually up from 0.7% in 2024. And the South African government is estimating it that it will grow, the economy that is, by about 1.7% this year, which means a growth rate of 1%. That may not sound like a lot, but it's actually a lot more than we've had in the past. So let's actually consider some of the risks to the economy and see whether we're actually going to have this growth rate. So the most important one is actually, Donald Trump, I'm afraid, because you see, with Donald Trump coming into the office, a lot of people are moving to the dollar. Why the dollar? Well, because you see, Trump is promising forms of trade protectionism, which possibly could mean tariffs around the world. And when tariffs around the world are put in place, that means that their trade becomes basically a little bit speculative. And so a lot of people think, well, where's trade unlikely to be speculative? Well, one of the largest economies in the world, they think. So go to the dollar because they're big. And it kind of makes sense. Now, what we're also seeing coinciding all of this at the same time is that China's growth rate is actually on the decline, which means that the typical thing that South Africa would do is trade with China. China is, after all, our largest trade partner. But you see, their growth rate being a decline means that they're actually wanting to export more and buy less. One of the biggest risks that we have to the economy in 2025 is actually AGOA, which expires in September of this year. And for those of you who don't know, there is a large push to get South Africa's access to AGOA to be reviewed, basically because of our stance on Israel and our stance on Russia. Now, there are those who say South Africa shouldn't have access to this trade tariff-free region, and that's basically because we're not actually that small an economy. The idea behind AGOA is that basically it's supposed to help the small guys out, and some people argue, well, South Africa is not one of the small guys, so it doesn't really need the help. In any case, AGOA leaving the country could mean some jobs are put at risk. Now, one of the next big major concerns is that government still doesn't appear to be moving with any form of urgency, and we've seen this substantially in that a lot of the ministers, let's use the agricultural ministry as an example, don't really appear to be doing anything in any form of rush. Yeah, there's lots of talk and, people always like to talk, but we're not actually seeing the fruits of that at the moment. Now, let us not forget that parties such as the MK party said that basically you weren't going to get the economic growth with the GNU that they promised, and this is obviously all going to ultimately fall into their hands if the growth is not actually forthcoming. Remember that the New Dawn, for the second time, was promised on economic growth. A lot of people are watching to see it, and if we don't get it, the likelihood is that parties will gravitate towards something that is rather radical, because we've tried all the alternatives. Now, one of the other big problems that we're going to have is obviously fiscal discipline, and specifically in lowering the debt burden, because you see, we need to reduce our wage bill. Now, you see, that exact wage bill that we need to reduce affects 1.3 million government employees. And at the current time of recording, the original wage negotiations, because we're at that time of year again, when they want their pay increases, the original pay negotiations started off with the unions asking for 12%. Now, for those of you with a brain cell, you'd say, well, typically most that we would typically want to give, especially when we're adopting forms of austerity, probably be around the inflation rate. And again, the SACP and COSATU, one of the reasons that they say they're falling out with the ANC is because the ANC wants to adopt austerity. But I don't know how much austerity they're adopting when currently the wage negotiation started off at 4.7%, inflation's at 2.9%. In fact, the central bank says that if you want to keep things at forms of price anchoring, in other words, prices do go up, but you want wages to reflect the prices, then you would give everybody a wage increase of 4.5%, and the government's currently offered 4.7%. And the unions say they want 6 now. So they've gone from 12 to 6, and everybody's kind of saying that they think they're going to be at about 5.5, which is still above inflation. So you're in a difficult position where you need to adopt fiscal discipline in order to show international reform, and you're going to offer above inflation. Yeah, it's typical wage negotiations in South Africa. So let's actually then go on to local government reform. Well, a lot of local government reform needs to occur because for those of you who haven't noticed, Joburg's bankrupt. Yeah, the richest city in South Africa is bankrupt. And a lot of it is blamed on ANC patronage. And you see, because there's a high degree of ANC patronage and stealing through the network, there appears to be no desire to actually tackle the problem. Now, two of the big problems that a lot of people aren't yet talking about is actually around the ANC and the DA's succession. You see, because Cyril Ramaphosa has now served his 2 terms, so when he gets through to the next conference, they're going to need to elect a new leader. And that new leader would eventually, should the ANC win the next election, become our next president. And the only 2 individuals in the running are Paul Mashtile and Imbalula. That's it. Now you see, that has led many individuals to argue that unfortunately none of the successors, the potential successors, are actually good enough to be able to warrant any form of investor confidence. And you see, the problem isn't confined to the ANC because you see, John Steenhuisen has made it clear that he doesn't really want to be running again. He did say that this term would kind of be the end of his tenure. He's now hit government minister statuses. And so the actual chance of him staying on to be leader at the next conference is non-existent at this point. So who will take over from him? And that's the problem. Who's also another big hitter? India doesn't really have any. So there is potentially the current Minister of Basic Education. She's a rather heavy hitter. Will she want to run? Don't know. Outside of her, who else is there? Don't know. And that, again, causes investor issues because you see the investors don't have any form of bedded relationship with people. And so they're not really wedded to the idea of a potential successor. So who do they have? And that's a question for both political parties. You could say, well, go to the MK parties, go Jacob Zuma. Yeah, he's in his late 70s. He ain't being anywhere near the next elections. So outside of the usual stuff, you see, we also have problems in South Africa now with water shedding. And that does mean that whilst the energy sector has gone through forms of reform, the water sector is also currently going through forms of reform. And that reform is going to be urgently needed for forms of economic growth. Transnet and the railway systems still need fixing. They're not really any further along the lines. And you see, one of the big problems we have is that if we really want economic growth in South Africa, we actually need large corporates, large business to come and invest in South Africa. Many of them don't want to. And some of it actually has to do with Trump because they don't know what that form of protectionism is going to look like. And they don't know what the trade tariffs could look like. So they're reluctant to invest in South Africa when that investment could be rather risky. So at the moment, they're just kind of waiting and seeing. This is not helping that at the moment, because a lot of people are moving to the dollar is strengthening. And because the current rate for government bonds in the US is at 4.7, and given that the rand is actually weakening against the dollar, means that it doesn't actually make sense to invest in any government bonds or any infrastructure projects or anything in South Africa. And it's an emerging market. You see, if you put your same money in the US, you get a better return just because of the stability of the dollar and the weakness of the rand. And that their current rates are actually kind of high. So how would things actually improve in South Africa? Well, for you and me, as the average punter who lives here, we'd like to see the interest rate go down. You see, but the interest rate goes down, people don't invest here because they don't get as good a return on their money. So what would happen in the US to help us? Well, the best thing that they could do is reduce their rates. I mean, it'd be great for them and it'd be great for us because people would come over here and basically give us a cash. It doesn't help investor sentiment in the US. Now, you see, one of the biggest things, and for me personally, the biggest risks to the South African economy, and one of the other reasons that big business doesn't want to come here, is BEE, specifically around the licensing criteria, because as Salgalige has raised in numerous press releases, is that we have what we call third wave BEE. And this is where there's no actual legal requirement to have BEE exerted on you, but what they do is they enforce BEE as part of the licensing criteria. Fail to abide by that, we don't grant you a license because, you wouldn't be a fair player. A really good example is, let's say, for example, the petrol industry. Petrol industry, if you don't have at least 25% BEE, and some petrol stations will require you to have 50% BEE, you can't own a petrol station. Which means what we typically tend to see is that mom and pop's business, basically mom and pop's dies, they leave the business to their kids, and the kids can't actually inherit it. Because you see, that would be a licensing change, but they don't have the requirement, bean countering. Because of that, they basically have to give 50% of the business away, basically close the business. And if you drive around any town, I'm sure you'll find numerous petrol stations that are basically empty. And the story of those quite often could be, and very often is, a BEE story. In other words, you couldn't actually get a BEE investor who actually wants to take the actual business over. Now, at the moment, we're actually seeing this even in relation to law firms in South Africa. Law firms need to have some form of BEE according to the latest criteria. Now, this is only, I'm told, only really applies to law firms that are doing government work. And those law firms that are doing forms of government work would have to abide by this. The other way to be exempt from it is to be below the 5 million threshold, but that's virtually no one. So at the end of the day, what that really means is that you either have to kind of move away from government work, kind of play the game. But you see, what does tend to happen is that firms that do specialize in government work and also private sector work, personal suing, conveyancing, whatever else, is that they may adopt the BEE framework because of government work. Now, for me, I might say no government work, so I don't have to be abiding by it because that business is BEE compliant. They may require me to be BEE compliant as a proxy in order to do work with them. So indirectly, they still apply BEE on me, even though I've kind of taken myself out the pool of work where it would apply. And so forth and so forth and so forth. Now, it's not the only industry where this occurs. And ultimately, what that does mean is that if you're an investor from overseas, say an American, probably likely to be white, you want them to come over here with large business and invest here. The first thing you're going to do is say, licensing criteria, make sure you be, and we've seen this with Elon Musk. And many times they're going to go, well, that's incredibly racist. We actually have rules in the United States that prohibit this from occurring. Why would I go to a country where you're basically going to expropriate a large section of my business in order to satisfy your racist rules? And there is a large degree of that. There is a large degree of racism. Because what it's doing is it's actually excluding a sector of the economy in order to force them to adopt another section of the economy that has no skin in the game, that might not necessarily want to be there in the first place, and so forth and so forth. So where's the reform on that front? Well, we are told that the DA would deeply anti this kind of thing. But they are in government right now when the relevant minister of Labour basically said that they're going to be pushing forward the affirmative action targets that affect businesses above 50%. These are the biggest problem. The reason that the law firms are moaning about the last BEE compliance, the one I just referenced, is that this BEE stuff already applies, but they're changing the rules because the rules always change. They give you rules that you go, oh yeah, that's not too bad. I suppose we can kind of work with that. And then they force them. Before you know it, you basically don't have control over your firm anymore. You've had to give it away to somebody who never worked for it. Now, anybody from an overseas perspective that wants to come and invest their cash can look at that and go, it's not for me. So unfortunately, got to come back to the original question. So the GNU was put in place because we need economic growth. So the question I leave you with, ladies and gentlemen, is, are we going to get it? Well, according to the IMF, going to get some. Is it going to be enough? Is it going to be muted? Are we actually going to get to next year and going, didn't really have the economic growth that we expected? Many people are speculating on this at the moment, and I'd love to hear your comments in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.